Welcome this afternoon, everyone. We are delighted to be here with you today and with colleagues from across the Angel Network as we consider some new and emerging research in regard to networking itself. I just wanted to focus a little bit on the research that we are going to hear more of this afternoon. And I have to say to you that while obviously I myself am fascinated by the question of networking, that I've been grappling a little bit since Massimiliano first introduced this idea to me some years ago about the idea of doing research that focuses on the region of North America and Europe. Because while I can understand that from some perspectives, this might be seen as one region, at the same time, in Gene, we work in Europe, and we're not used to thinking of North America and Europe as one region. And I might come back at the end to some ideas of Europe and North America. But what fascinates me is that we in Gene have a challenge in this thinking to look at bridges that might be built between networks in North America and in Europe. And so I think without further ado, I will hand over to Massimiliano Tarozzi to begin the presentation on the research. Massimiliano.
Thank you. So let me share my screen first. Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We are presenting the result of a study aimed at investigating who are the global citizenship education key players in influencing policy and to some extent even practice, especially practice innovation, and aim at mapping relationships that connect them as a network of global citizenship education providers and policy actors in Europe and North America, which is a region recognized within the UNESCO and United Nations Organization of the World. Is one of the 6 regions of the world. In my presentation, I will first introduce the methodological approach and research design. Then Lynette will focus on some of the key results. And talking about the research team, I would like to thank this really fabulous research team, and especially the 2 research assistants, Carla Inguaggiato and Kerry Karsgaard, who both have expertise in social network analysis and digital research methods, as well as the 2 additional research assistants, Francis Owuzu and Kester Müller. Okay, why studying global citizenship education as a network? There are 3 reasons that led us to study global citizenship education from a network perspective. First of all, an epistemological positioning. Lynette and myself are both in line with those research approaches and theoretical frameworks in social sciences, and especially in political science, which believe that reality is relational. And the social sphere can be better investigated by highlighting relationships and networks rather than by studying the substantive characteristics of individual actors in isolation. Secondly, the very nature, the distinctiveness nature of global citizenship education as research object. Based on our own research experience in the field and also being part of the network, we both believe that global citizenship education phenomenon, the processes of policy making, the development of innovative educational practices, the circulation of information among key institutions, and also the conceptual co-construction of global citizenship education ideas take shape through networks. And third, finally, an accidental circumstance. Since APSEU and the Ban Ki-moon Center based in Vienna approached us to design this kind of study to further develop the collaboration and partnership for global citizenship education. I would like to thank both these institutions for the vision in supporting and funding this research. When we were approached with this request, Lynette and myself both agreed that the priority was to carry out an inquiry into the network, and especially into the relationship between Europe and North America. According to social network perspective, a social, political, or even educational phenomenon cannot be understood if it's segmented or isolated or from the social relation in which it's embedded. The assumption of social network analysis is that individual characteristics, so-called attribute in the jargon of social network analysis, are not enough to capture the complexity of the phenomenon. Social network analysis aims at measuring, describing the structure of relations, so the ties among social entities called nodes. In our case, we were interested in the degree and patterns of integration among the members, among the nodes. In particular, we wanted to investigate the structural characteristics of networks and therefore try to understand the main features of the pattern of collaboration, information exchange, and meetings among these actors. This approach seems particularly suitable, as we mentioned, to study global citizenship education phenomenon, because it is conceptually weak and controversial by definition. It has been generated by global policy. It has been widely implemented through a multi-stakeholder and cross-sectorial approach. So it's always a negotiated concept. That's why it's so good an approach of a social network analysis to approach it. In this field, probably more than in other fields, social relationships seems to prevail over organizational characteristics. And this has a huge impact on the social capital dimension generated by these social relationships, which become key to understand the global citizenship education community. The social capital dimension, according to Bourdieu, appears to be a strategic lens through which look at the material benefits and resources generated by the possession of a stable network of relationship, or by being part of a group and sharing the capital collectively owned. Therefore, in this research, we work to identify the extent to which the network of global citizenship education key players constitutes a source of social capital for its member and the symbolic dimension through which they represent it. In order to map multiple ties among active promoters of global citizenship education across Europe and North America, we adopted two parallel and complementary methodological approaches, which are both based on a relational approach to research and on the same close list of policy actors. According to the literature review, while in recent years there are some research has explored the role of both offline and digital network, and in particular on Twitter, well, global citizenship education has not been yet investigated in particular. With the exception of a study combining social network analysis and discourse analysis by Kolek and Yemini last year, social network analysis has never been used to investigate global citizenship education policy and practice. Therefore, our research question was quite original and probably meaningful. So first of all, the overall research question was, how do actors involved in the implementation of global citizenship education in Europe and North America cooperate? And therefore, how are the connection between individuals and pattern of relations connecting persons and groups, and other sub research questions that you can see here also related to the conceptualization of global citizenship education. And of course, one of the main goals of this research is also to try to provide some results that could assist in strengthening the global citizenship education dissemination effort. Data collection, we adopted two parallel and complementary ways to explore the network, as I mentioned. First of all, a proper technically defined social network analysis, a quantitative approach which allow us to systematically map and describe the relationship among key actors in global citizenship education in the region, according to representatives from organizations we identified. A structured interview was administered to global citizenship education players to understand how ideas connect with the network. Specifically, relationship of mutual cooperation, technical and scientific information exchange, and meetings between the actors were explored. These relations were analyzed with reference to key attributes of the global citizenship education actor, such as typology, organization, the geographical location, and global citizenship definition and emphasis. Secondly, the digital method is the other parallel component of our study applied this approach, this digital method, to map the links between the same roster of actors, looking at first their organizational websites and their use of Twitter using crawling technique. Digital methods complemented the social network analysis maps by allowing us to see actors, networks, and relationships that might be outside our familiar sphere or might be hidden, ignored, or disregarded. We use digital method as social and political research to map the actors and global citizenship education discourses associated around the same sampling we used for the social network analysis in step 1. So the definition of the actors was a key important step because we built the list of actors based on these criteria, geographical criteria. So all the actors should work in the North America on Europe, or if global, they should be included in these 2 geographical areas. They influence in shaping the governance of global citizenship education in the region. The role played in conceptualizing global citizenship education, the active role in promoting, fostering, disseminating this notion, and or being an education provider at any level. So one of these conditions to be included in the roster. Our starting point was a list of organizations mentioned in a workshop we organized in Montreal in 2019, which was conceived as a kind of a preliminary study for identify the initial list of actors. Then we further selected organizations. We took part to multi-stakeholder meetings across Europe, official multi-stakeholder meetings across Europe, North America, and or UNESCO. And so finally, the final data set was composed by 56 participants, including these types of organizations. You can see that civil society organization is the larger group or representative. After that, we received an ethical approval from the Research Ethics Board at the University of Alberta. We developed the questionnaire across multiple iterations in order to ensure that it captured both the attributes and the relations among the organization through the questionnaire. After then, we conducted a pilot phase. After that, 6 researchers carried out structured interview via Zoom, filling the questionnaires with the interview. So the data collection collected through the structured interviews was organized in 5 parts, collecting both the attributes and the relational systems, connecting those agents to the other overall network. Finally, I want to stress that the final point is the organization values and belief about global citizenship education. This was the only qualitative part with the open-ended questions, while all the other 4 parts were structured questions. The approach of the analysis, because Lynette will enter into the results. So we investigated 3 one-mode networks, actor to actors, based on the direct ties, and especially the technical information, the mutual collaboration. So when sometimes organization provides support on a policy issue for another organization, receiving similar support in return, or meetings to discuss global citizenship education related topics. We also, in addition, collect data for mapping network of relationship, and also gather information on the perceived influence of every actor. Then we analyze some structural properties of the networks, namely clustering, core, periphery, small world, reciprocity, by investigating a number of network measures such as density, connectedness, and network closure. And overall, instead of an egocentric study, we adopted a whole network design, which allowed us to identify both local and global social network properties. So you won't find yourself, your organization in the map because we look at the map as a whole network. The quantitative data were processed using the software UCINet, but also Gelfi, especially for digital analysis and issue crawling. We use this software to produce visualizations, but also to statistically analyze some of the properties. To conclude, some of the limitation of this study, because today we are presenting some preliminary results of this study, and there are of course some limitations, especially due to the time constraints and not to mention the limitation due to the pandemic global situation, because all the data were collected during a global pandemic. So first of all, quantitative data cannot capture meanings and way in which they are generated and socially negotiated. Statistical analysis, today we are presenting especially results based on a statistical analysis, doesn't explain social relationship in a comprehensive and consistent way. That's why the study encompasses a second part where we will collect qualitative data through focus group. Secondly, why administer instructor questionnaire based on a roster with a predefined list of organizations allow us to have a whole network map? It tends to select organizations that are the most prominent and might exclude less visible organizations. So this is another limitation of our approach. Third, we collected ties at one point in time, and that point was precisely in the middle of a pandemic. So we don't know if and the extent to which this relation evolve over time. So we need another extra data collection in another point of time to have more relevant and meaningful results. And finally, as for digital research and in particular Twitter analysis, we explore ties among organizations only through hashtag use, because at time of the study, further Twitter data were not available, simply they're not available. So we plan to complement a more sophisticated Twitter analysis as soon as further data will be available, and especially the mentioning and the co-follower dimension. As soon as they are available, we will include in the future analysis. Okay, now that's all for the introduction of the methodology and theoretical framework behind this, underpinning this research. And then I'm happy to invite Lynette to take the floor and present some of the results.
Well, thanks everyone. And I'm happy to be here, and thank you for that really solid description of the research so far. So my task today is to present some of the findings from the study. And you know, as a researcher, this was just such a fabulous project. And so I'm going to walk you through some of the preliminary findings that we've got so far, and they really are quite exciting. I'm going to show you 3 maps that show the network patterns. And so we have a big conversation about whether this is a region or not, but we did identify a network. We could study this network and look at how, see that there are relations and work is being done within this network to achieve global citizenship education. So the 3 patterns that I'll show you. One is about mutual collaboration. So a network, this graph shows us network relations and how the organizations in this network are working in a collaborative way. Now, I'll just give you a little background so you can read what this screen is saying. First of all, the nodes, the circles, are organizations, right? So they're listed according to a short name, but don't focus on those. So the circles tell us the organizations. Now, the size is not about bigger and better. The size indicates the percentage of resources that are devoted to global citizenship education. So a big dot says this is an organization that devotes more than 50% of their resources toward global citizenship. A smaller dot indicates that would be under that. So then the nodes, the lines, the ties that we have, each of the lines represent the presence of a relationship among the organizations, so between organizations. And so overall, we can see the lines showing the relationships of mutual collaboration. So in this map, it's European organizations are colored in dark blue and North American organizations are colored in red. And you can see that the position of the node is determined by the number of ties, the links with other organizations. The nodes with the higher number of ties are the most central in the network. Therefore, the organizations, the nodes, that are on the periphery are the ones with fewer ties. So the closer to the center you are, the organization is, it means it has more ties. We'll talk a bit more about what that means in a minute. Can you go on to the next slide, Max? So you can see the relationships for technical and scientific information shows a much more dense set of relations and of interconnections. And you can see, again, while the colors indicate a separation in Europe and North America, you can still see there are many ties of many relationships, even across the two regions. So the third pattern that we saw was related to meetings. So organizations that actually met together to do some kind of work. And this included both Zoom meetings as well as face-to-face meetings. And you can see that there's not as dense as the other network graphs, but the patterns that we see, the division of the two geographical area is clearly visible in the network graphs. Nodes of the same color are closely located. And the organizations that we had some organizations represented by a square here, and they were not part of they weren't interviewed. And so they're mostly on the periphery. So you start to see some organizations on the periphery and some clustering within the center. So one of the things that was really interesting also in this finding is that there wasn't a clear pattern between the dimensions of the node, the size of the circles, the resources devoted to global citizenship, and its position within the network. So it seemed to suggest that the centrality in the network is not a function of the resources devoted to global citizenship education. So that's a really interesting finding that we're going to follow up to understand a little bit more. So that's the first set of network analysis. And if we can go to the next slide. The second finding that we're working with is how center-periphery relations were visible in the network. Again, I just give you a few tips on how to read this. Like, we're looking at a network, not at individual actors. So if you look at the whole network, it shows a particular set of relations. So the node colors indicate being at the core or the periphery. So the organizations in green are in the periphery, and the orange ones are considered in the core. The node shape indicates the scale of action of the organization. So if you'll notice that some of the organizations have a triangle and some are a circle in a box. The triangle shape highlights organizations that are multi-scalar, while all the others have the shape within a box. So in this data, we found that multi-scalar organizations were formed most of the center of the network. So it made a difference if an organization worked locally, nationally, regionally, and globally in terms of the number of relations that they had. So we looked at the technical scientific information exchange in terms of core and periphery. And again, we noted that organizations at the core have an advantage of being embedded in a denser system of relations. However, being in the core does not imply that these organizations were necessarily more influential or more powerful. We're going to investigate this more in a follow-up qualitative study to understand exactly how does that work? How do the center and periphery relations work in the organization? What impact, what are the directions, the flows of information from the center to the periphery and back? And it's, when we look at the organizations, it seems quite a very dynamic kinds of relations. So it's not necessarily more influence within this center if you're in the center, but you have more engagement. But the role of peripheral organizations are quite interesting when we go into the idea of conceptual communities. It drew us into the analysis and linked with the qualitative data that was collected in the survey. And while that's limited, it formed a really interesting finding and one that we'll take into the qualitative study. So we looked at the idea of what was evident, that there are conceptual communities, and that's a concept that's used within social network analysis, but it's certainly also reflected in much of the research on global citizenship education. We're all quite aware of how many studies on global citizenship and global citizenship education that turn to a kind of mapping of the concepts and the practices, identifying that there really isn't one way to do global citizenship education. There's not one understanding of what global citizenship might be or what should form the study of global citizenship within education. So our study also supported that. A map emerged of conceptual communities. And so in examining the network as a whole, it was clear that the global citizenship definitions that were shared by the organizations included a really interesting intermixing of goals and actions, concepts, orientations, issues, and future visions. And they were all really mixed together under what people called a definition of global citizenship and global citizenship education. And so that kind of diversity in the language indicated very diverse positions, and rather than an overarching guiding definition. And this helped us to really think about the significance of the core and periphery in the network. So it isn't that there's the core organizations communicate out to the periphery a particular notion of global citizenship, although there's some of that. But there is also much more dynamic exchanges going on. There are some harmonies evident through organizations' use of language pertaining to the SDG 4.7 and Agenda 2030. But most organizations, or many organizations, appear to be developing individual or nuanced definitions of GCED. So what we did is, using keywords, developed and studied the language within the definitions that organizations provided, the definitions that they are using for global citizenship. And it really mapped out into a set of conceptual communities. And so I'll just go through this. When you read the report, you'll see it's in a much bigger chart that doesn't really fit into a PowerPoint screen. So I'm just going to run through some of the key ideas from that. The first and largest conceptual community we found was around the notion of global community for justice and sustainability. These are the green dots. So in this is the largest cluster, and it spans much of the center of the network and includes the most frequently used tags for sustainability, global challenges, and action. And the key terms in the cluster range from more liberal notions of inclusivity, sustainability, intercultural understanding, but also including solidarity, equity, justice. So some critical perspectives. And it's very closely related to the pink clusters that were related to international policy. And those related very specifically to global policy on SDG 4.7 and Agenda 2030. So you can see the impact those policies are having on shaping understandings of and work on global citizenship education. There's another one, and if you look at the blue dots, you might not be able to see it because we can't make it big enough. And these we called a category of there are no easy answers. And so this group of organizations take the position that rather than focusing on specific ideas and issues, this cluster, this community works with the ideas of reciprocity and questioning naive kinds of work that it suggests empowerment and action-oriented global citizenship. A very interesting keyword that came up in these was the word anti-modern, and it positioned the community outside of many of the common GCED discourses pertaining to notions of modern progress and development. So this is quite challenging to the linking of global citizenship education and development education. Now we have another cluster of organizations in light blue. This is a cluster on the periphery that is centered around individual development and entrepreneurship that looks at transitioning youth to adulthood by focusing on responsibility, self-esteem, and economic literacy. In the orange dots, this is interesting from my position in Canada on Treaty 6 territory, decoloniality and interconnection. So this, the orange dots were all Canadian organizations, and the contribution what this cluster brings into the network is notions of decoloniality, anti-colonial orientations, along with an ecological emphasis on both humans and non-human life. Maybe, Liam, we could talk a little more about what that might say about these relationships between North America and Europe in some of that conversation. The black dots indicate a focus on democracy, and this is linking global citizenship education with democracy, government, and democratic participation, ideas of fairness, equality, and civics. The dark green dots, the clusters look at global competencies. They use the language of education and competencies and references to the global marketplace, as well as global citizenship connected to behaviors, intercultural relations, or cultural awareness. Second to last, we have in the mustard colored cluster organizations that look at the cooperation of individuals. Again, so this is not a focus on individuals, but the relationships of individuals. And it's focused on the links between individuals according to a sense of mutuality and interdependence. And it connects individual care and empathy to cooperation and collective action. So a really strong sense of moral education that is connected into global citizenship education. We had two organizations that we're calling a satellite category. And they were two organizations that in their description of the definition, in their definitions, they didn't provide quite enough information that we could do an analysis on it. So they're a little bit positioned outside of the network at this time. In our qualitative study, we might pick that up again with those organizations. Again, I'll address this maybe later. It's Twitter also showed us, really gave us information about the relationships of and the language on core and periphery, but maybe we'll leave that for now. From this qualitative piece of the network analysis, we bring a few questions into that we'll be following up on. So the idea of competition and collaboration within the network, and the Twitter analysis certainly gave us some questions around the attention economy, how attention and through being visible provides a kind of material benefit. And so we'll be investigating that a little bit more. We'll look at global policy and local initiatives, and how are they a one-way communication? Does the network work to distribute those from the center to the periphery, or to what degree are those based and informed and changed by local activities? So are these dynamic relationships, or are they fairly static and unidirectional? Again, we ran into some interesting things about language when you study North America and in Europe, the dominance of English language, and how that impacted this network was significant. In the case of Canada with the French and English, and in Europe with the multiple languages. Again, there was a lot of information emerging out of the digital study that gave us a lot of questions around the geographic orientation toward the global south. And so again, it reinforces maybe some of the things you talked about, Liam, the question around, is this is the region that's considered the global north, and was that visible, and how visible that was within the Twitter data that we collected and are analyzing. So those things we're bringing forward into the next part of this study. Thanks for listening.
First of all, I'd like to thank our speakers today. Thank you very much for the insight and for sharing this new and emerging research and the initial version of it. And I think we all might give a round of virtual applause to Massimiliano, Lynette, and also to Carla and Carrie. I'm conscious also that those who have supported this research, UNESCO, APCU, and the Ban Ki-moon Center, I believe that they're within our participants. Thank you very much. And if you would like to say something, you're more than welcome now for a minute or two.
Yes, gladly, Liam. Thank you so much. Lynette, Massimiliano, big thanks to you and your research teams for this very interesting study. Of course, it merits to have more dwelling on the findings, and it merits to probably have even an additional step taking some of your findings forward. I think it's exemplary to have this overview of the North American and European network partners. I hope it actually instills for some of us the desire to collaborate even closer and to look at how to draw in the periphery, or how to become an even more active player in the middle, in the center of it, without wanting to qualify now that one is better than the other. All of us are needed. And fact is that research like yours sheds a light on important issues, as GCED often is so difficult to be grasped. And this will be yet another stepping stone to link the partners. So thanks so much from the Ban Ki-moon Center side. Thank you also to your colleagues, of course, at the universities of Alberta and Bologna, and APCU, UNESCO APCU, for making this research possible. And we hope that hopefully in the future, we will see further studies like this.
I should also say on behalf of Jean, we are fascinated by the research. We have many questions. I suspect that one of those who influenced Jean most 20 years ago when we were starting was Paul Engels from the European Centre for Development Policy Management, who wrote very articulately about the nature of policy learning and learning in networks. And he always distinguished clearly between network as a verb and network as a noun. So I suspect that I'll be reading the research with that sort of a lens. So looking forward to further discussion on this. Thank you all for being here, and good evening. Take care.